Welcome to LexTalks, legal topics simplified, your guide to navigating the world of law.
Absolutely.
Today, we're diving into the heart of the Indian Constitution.
Yes.
We are exploring the fascinating interplay between fundamental rights and directive principles of state policy.
Okay.
Now, if you're a law student in India,
Yeah.
especially if those UPSC exams are looming,
Mm-hmm.
these concepts are absolute must-haves.
Oh, for sure.
What's intriguing is that while these two might seem like separate legal universes,
Yeah.
they're more like two sides of the same coin,
I like that.
constantly interacting and shaping the landscape of Indian law.
Yeah.
Two sides of the same coin.
Yeah.
But before we get into how they work together, let's break them down one by one.
Okay.
First up, fundamental rights.
Yes.
What's the elevator pitch for those?
So think of fundamental rights as your personal arsenal of freedoms,
Okay.
explicitly laid out in Part 3 of the Indian Constitution from Articles 12 to 35.
All right.
They're not just aspirations.
Yeah.
They're justiciable, which means you can actually go to court to enforce them.
So if the government tries to step on your right to free speech or equality,
Yeah.
you can take them to court and say, hey, back off. This is my fundamental,
Exactly.
powerful tools
Yes, very powerful tools.
for citizens to hold the government accountable.
Absolutely.
But hold on. I remember learning that even fundamental rights aren't absolute.
Mm-hmm.
There are exceptions, right?
You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
Most of these rights can be temporarily suspended during a national emergency.
Okay.
It's a bit like hitting the pause button
Okay.
on certain freedoms when the nation's security is at stake.
I
It's
see.
the delicate balance
Yeah.
that democracies all over the world grapple with.
Makes sense in extreme situations.
Yeah.
Sometimes extraordinary measures are needed.
Right.
But thankfully, those situations are rare.
Yes, thankfully.
So back to normal times, these fundamental rights protect a whole range of freedoms.
Oh, I have
We're not just talking about free speech.
Yeah, we're talking about 6 key types of rights. You've got your right to equality, freedom, protection from exploitation,
Okay.
freedom of religion,
Uh-huh.
your cultural and educational rights,
Right.
and crucially, the right to constitutional remedies.
Wait, break that last one down for me.
Sure,
Constitutional remedies. What does that even mean?
that's the right. That gives you the power to go to court in the first place to protect all of those other rights.
So it's like the key that unlocks the whole system.
You got it.
Got it.
It's very important.
So those are fundamental rights, powerful, enforceable, but with a few carefully defined exceptions.
Yes.
Now let's flip the coin, so to speak,
Okay.
and talk about those directive principles of state policy.
All right.
They sound a bit more like guidelines, not something you could necessarily take to court.
That's a great way to put it.
Okay.
Directive Principles,
Yeah.
outlined in Part 4 of the Constitution, Articles 36 to 51,
Mm.
are more like a blueprint for the government to build a society that's socially and economically just. They're aspirational setting goals for the state to strive for.
So it's like the Constitution saying, hey, government, here's what a truly awesome, fair India could look like. Go make it happen.
Exactly.
But here's the catch. They're non-justiciable,
Yes,
meaning you can't run to court if you feel they're not being upheld.
that is correct.
Right. That's where my law student brain gets a bit puzzled.
Okay.
If they're not legally enforceable, how can they have any real impact?
Right.
Are they just pretty words?
Well, that's a question that has sparked many a debate.
I bet.
But their power lies in their ability to shape government policy, to nudge them toward creating a welfare state.
Okay.
For instance, take Article 40, which promotes village panchayats as units of self-governance.
Right. The idea of empowering local communities, that's a classic directive principle, right?
Exactly.
And while it's not something you can sue over,
Yeah.
it's inspired the entire Panchayati Raj system,
Mm-hmm.
a concrete example of how these principles can translate into real-world change.
Exactly. A great example.
So they're like the guiding philosophy behind the laws,
Yes.
even if they're not the laws themselves.
Precisely.
And they've had a huge influence on everything from labor laws to education policy.
Yes, they have.
Okay, so now I'm really curious how these two seemingly different concepts,
Okay.
fundamental rights, which you can enforce,
Yeah.
and directive principles, which are more like guiding lights,
Mm-hmm.
how do they actually work together in practice?
That's where things get really interesting.
Okay.
It's like a dance.
Okay.
Sometimes a harmonious waltz, sometimes a more energetic tango.
Okay, I'm hooked. Tell me more about this legal dance.
Well, in the early years after independence, the Supreme Court tended to see fundamental rights as having a higher status.
Okay.
But a landmark case in 1973,
Mm.
Keshavananda Bharti v. State of Kerala.
Keshavananda Bharti. Now, that's a name every law student knows.
It is.
But remind me what was so groundbreaking about it.
This case was a turning point. The court basically said, hold on, both fundamental rights and directive principles are integral to the Constitution. They shouldn't be seen as rivals, but as partners,
Okay.
working together to achieve the ultimate goal of a just and balanced society.
So it's not a case of one being better than the other.
Right.
It's about finding a way to make them work together.
Exactly.
And that's where the doctrine of harmonious construction comes in.
Yes.
It's a principle that encourages courts to interpret laws in a way that gives effect to both fundamental rights and directive principles as much as possible.
As much as possible, that's right.
So it's like saying, hey, judges, when you're looking at a law, don't just focus on the individual's rights, but also consider the broader social good that the directive principles are aiming for.
You got it.
It's about finding that sweet spot, that balance between individual liberty and social justice.
Exactly. Welcome back to LexTalks. Before the break, we were unpacking this fascinating dance between fundamental rights and directive principles in the Indian Constitution.
A dance. I love that. But it's one thing to talk about it in theory. It's another to see how it actually plays out in the real world. So give me some concrete examples. Where have these directive principles actually made a difference?
Oh, they're all over the legal landscape, shaping laws and policies in ways you might not even realize. Take labor laws, for example. Think about the Minimum Wages Act of 1948 that came directly out of the Directive Principles, specifically Article 43, which calls for securing a living wage and a decent standard of living for all workers.
So the idea that everyone deserves a wage they can actually live on, that's not just common sense. It's enshrined in the Constitution, even if it's not a fundamental right.
Exactly, and it's not just about wages. Look at the Bonded Labor System Abolition Act of 1976, aimed at eradicating forced labor. That, too, has its roots in the Directive Principles, reflecting this commitment to social and economic justice.
Okay, so the directive principles are speaking up for workers' rights. What about other areas? We talked about the Panchayati Raj system earlier, inspired by Article 40 and the idea of local self-governance. Any other examples of these principles turning into actual policies?
Oh, tons. Education is a great example. The Right to Education Act of 2009, which made elementary education a fundamental right for kids aged 6 to 14. That was heavily influenced by Article 45, which calls for free and compulsory education.
Wow. So a directive principle, which isn't directly enforceable, actually paved the way for something to become a fundamental right, which is enforceable. That's pretty powerful.
It is, and that right to education is further bolstered by Article 21A, the right to life and personal liberty, which the courts have interpreted quite broadly to include education as essential for a dignified life.
So it's like a chain reaction with these directive principles, setting things in motion and leading to concrete changes in the legal landscape.
You're getting it. And this ripple effect extends to other areas, like public health. Remember Article 47, which talks about the state's responsibility to raise the standard of living and improve public health.
Yeah, that one stuck with me.
Well, that article has been cited by the courts in all sorts of cases related to things like environmental protection and public health initiatives. So even though people can't directly go to court and say, hey, you're violating Article 47, those principles are still shaping how other laws are interpreted and applied.
It's like they're working behind the scenes, influencing the whole legal system.
Yeah.
So the courts are really key here, right? They're the ones bridging the gap between these non-justiciable directive principles and the enforceable fundamental rights.
Absolutely. The judiciary, especially the Supreme Court, has been masterful at using directive principles as interpretive tools, figuring out how to give them weight, even though they're not directly enforceable.
All right, legal eagle, give me an example. How have the courts actually used these directive principles in practice?
Okay, let's take the case of State of Bombay versus FN Balsara. It was all about the validity of a prohibition law banning alcohol, basically. And the Supreme Court upheld that law, citing Article 47 and its emphasis on public health. They said prohibiting booze was in line with that directive principle of improving public health.
So they used a principle that's not legally binding to justify a law that is binding.
It's fascinating.
Right. It shows you how the courts are using directive principles as guideposts, helping them understand the spirit and intent behind laws.
Are there other cases where they've done this using directive principles to shape their interpretation of the law?
Oh, tons. Another interesting one is Champakam Dora Rajan, which dealt with reservations in educational institutions. The court upheld reservations but also emphasized the importance of balancing social justice as reflected in the directive principles with individual rights, which are those fundamental rights we talked about earlier.
Sounds like the courts are constantly walking this tightrope, trying to find that perfect balance between those two sets of principles. Exactly. It's a delicate act, and judicial interpretation is key to making sure both sides get their due.
This is all incredibly insightful.
Yeah.
It's amazing to see how these directive principles, while not enforceable on their own, have had such a profound impact on the legal landscape of India.
It really speaks to the vision of the Constitution's framers. They understood that a truly just society needs both the protection of individual freedoms and a commitment to broader social and economic well-being.
It's like they created this beautiful symphony with fundamental rights and directive principles playing different but complementary melodies.
Beautifully put. But of course, even the most beautiful symphony can have its dissonances. There are challenges and debates surrounding this interplay, questions about how to balance competing interests and make those lofty ideals a reality.
Okay, now you've got me really curious. What are some of those challenges? What are the potential downsides of this approach?
Well, that's a discussion for our final act.
Welcome back to LexTalks for the final act of our deep dive into fundamental rights and directive principles.
Yes.
We've seen how they work together, shaping laws,
Mhm.
guiding courts,
Yes.
and pushing India toward a more just society.
Uh-huh.
But let's be real, no system is perfect.
Yeah.
So what are some of the challenges that come with this two-sided approach?
Well, you're right. There are definitely some inherent tensions and potential pitfalls. One of the biggest criticisms of directive principles is that they lack teeth. Critics argue that their non-justiciable nature makes them more like aspirational guidelines than enforceable rights.
So it's like having a beautiful recipe for a delicious cake, but no oven to bake it in.
That's a good analogy. A
Right.
government can always plead lack of resources or prioritize other agendas, leaving these principles on the back burner.
Yeah.
And that can be especially frustrating for marginalized communities who are often the intended beneficiaries of these principles.
Right. It's one thing to say everyone deserves a living wage or a good education.
Yeah.
It's another to actually make it happen.
Exactly. And even if there's the political will, implementing these principles across a country as vast and diverse as India is a Herculean task. Think about it. We're talking about a massive population, complex social structures, often limited resources. Turning those broad principles into concrete policies that reach every corner of the nation. That's a tall order.
So good intentions only get you so far.
Right.
You need effective governance, administrative capacity, and of course, cold hard cash to make it all work.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And this brings up another interesting point of contention, the very definition of what a right is. Some legal scholars argue that directive principles blur the line between fundamental rights and policy goals.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Break that down for me.
Well, think about your classic fundamental rights like freedom of speech or the right to a fair trial. These are often seen as negative rights, meaning they protect you from government interference. The state can't take these away from you.
But directive principles, they're different, right?
Right. They're often viewed as positive rights things the state is obligated to provide or ensure, like the right to work or the right to education.
So it's not just about stopping the government from doing bad things.
Right.
It's about making the government do good things.
Precisely. And this distinction between negative and positive rights can lead to some pretty heated debates. Some argue that enshrining positive rights in a constitution creates unrealistic expectations and puts too much burden on the state. Others counter that these positive rights are essential for a truly just society, especially for those who are most vulnerable.
So it's a debate about the role of the state,
Yeah.
what it should be responsible for,
Yeah.
and how far its reach should extend.
Exactly. And it's not just an Indian debate. It's a fundamental question that democracies all over the world wrestle with.
And how has India navigated this tricky terrain?
Well, the Indian Constitution's solution is to recognize both negative and positive rights, with fundamental rights covering those negative rights and directive principles addressing those positive ones.
But as we've seen, the line between the two isn't always so clear-cut.
Right, and that's where the courts come in again. They've been pretty clever at using directive principles to inform their interpretation of fundamental rights, even expanding their scope in some cases. For example, they've linked the right to life, a classic fundamental right, to the right to a clean environment, drawing inspiration from those directive principles about environmental protection.
So even though directive principles can't be directly enforced, they're still shaping the legal landscape, influencing how fundamental rights are understood and applied. It's like they're the silent partner in this constitutional dance.
That's a great way to put it. It's a testament to their enduring power, their ability to shape the vision of a just and equitable India.
And that brings us back to the core of what we've been exploring today. Fundamental rights and directive principles are two sides of the same coin. They might operate differently, but they're both working towards the same goal, that vision of a free and just India as envisioned by the Constitution.
And it's a constantly evading process, this dance between rights and principles. It involves not just the courts and the government, but also crucially citizens like you. Understanding this interplay and engaging in this ongoing conversation is essential for anyone who wants to contribute to building a better India.
So to all our LexTalks listeners out there, especially those future lawyers and judges, stay curious, keep asking questions, and use your legal knowledge to make a difference.
Thank you for listening to Lex Talks. Follow, subscribe, and stay notified for future episodes.